Here's Black Ribbon Day from an explanation coming from friend of the stream, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. No one else had non-aggression treaties with the Nazis, by the way. Nazi Germany was eventually defeated, but the reign of Soviet terror continued. That's an interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? It's kind of leaving out some crucial context, I feel. Nazi Germany was just defeated, but the reign of Soviet terror continued. You might even argue that this so-called reign of Soviet terror actually contributed heavily to the Nazis being defeated in the first place. And this is like not ironic. This is like completely unironic because the Victims of Communism Foundation literally lists Nazis as part of their like extensive, black book of communism. The so-called victims of communism. The Nazis themselves were victims of this Soviet reign of terror, as they remind us.
You're listening to Talking Diplomacy. This is a podcast about diplomacy and international relations brought to you by the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
What is this now?
August 23rd. It is an ordinary day for many people worldwide.
That's enough out of them. And here we have, in case you think this is some like niche conservative thing, here is a statement by the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, Justin Trudeau, on Black Ribbon Day. Today I join communities around the world to remember the victims of communism and Nazism in Europe. We stand with survivors and their descendants and with all those who continue to face violence and persecution from authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Talking about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We all have a role to play in defending and protecting human rights and democracy, both here at home and around the world. Liberals will continue to work with our partners to prevent crimes like these from happening, and together we will condemn crimes against humanity and hold those responsible accountable. I invite all Canadians to honor the victims of Europe on Black Ribbon Day. For our part, we will continue to work hard to make Canada and the world a safer place to call home. To all those who continue to face life under the threat of violent regimes, Canada stands with you. So that's Justin Trudeau talking about this. Thank you, Justin. So Dan Boeckner is going to be joining us in just a moment to talk about this very subject.
And how come, paradoxically as it sounds, the non-aggression pact paved a way for World War II? In this episode, we will delve deeper into the mystery surrounding the pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
All of those other non-aggression pacts are exactly what they say they are. They are non-aggression pacts where the two sides promise not to go to war with one another, promise to settle their differences by negotiation. And at first sight, the Nazi-Soviet pact is the same as that. The text of the pact itself is a standard non-aggression pact.
Roger Moorhouse is a historian specializing in modern German and Central Europe history and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Warsaw. In this episode, he is sharing the insights on the impact and consequences of the Soviet-Nazi pact. This interview was recorded as a part of a longer talk on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of
The Soviets did a lot of foul shit to their own people. How is this controversial? Well, what's controversial, Miyazaki's Lastan, sorry if I didn't pronounce that, is equating the crimes of the Nazis to the crimes of the Soviet Union. That's what's controversial. Because if you look at World War II history, the Soviet Union were the largest force responsible for defeating the Nazis in World War II. So it's what's controversial is saying the people who defeated the Nazis and the Nazis were just as bad. That's what's controversial, because that's historically inaccurate. And it's a form of Holocaust revisionism, frankly. Because the Soviet Union did the most out of any army in the West to stop the Holocaust and to liberate the concentration camps. So when you make the suggestion that they're as bad as the Nazis, or worse, as many of the people that follow this kind of stuff, which is what they say, that's a form of Holocaust revisionism. That's what's controversial about this. It's viewing things through the lens of horseshoe theory, which is both wrong and stupid. As we've talked about a couple of times, horseshoe theory is basically the bedrock that all of Western propaganda is built on. It's just as bad. It's the Nazis were bad, the communists were bad, and they're both just as bad. This is like the basic principle that all of our Western propaganda is built on. That's why it's important to understand this. Okay, so I got Dan Boeckner coming on. Dan's going to join us in just a minute. I'm not going to have any technical difficulties. There's going to be no technical difficulties whatsoever. This is my promise to you. This is my solemn promise. Hey, Dan, are you with us?
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, man.
How's it going?
Not
Dan
bad.
Boeckner, everybody.
Should I have this camera on?
Yeah, if you're comfortable with it. I know you
I
can't
am.
see me because my camera is broadcasting to Twitch.
That makes sense. Yeah.
If you don't find that too awkward, then
I do not.
okay, good.
Everybody gets to see my the cage where I keep all my clothes. And,
Nice. We all need a closed cage.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing, man?
I'm okay. I mean, you're here in Montreal, so you know it's fucking hot.
Yes, it's very hot. That's why I'm sleeveless right now, as people have been pointing out.
I'm sweaty. I'm ready for fall. I'm ready for winter. Bring it on.
Really?
I'm done with this.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm not quite there yet.
Bring on the deep freeze.
I always end up regretting it once we're in that zone.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thanks. I really appreciate you taking the time to join the show on such short notice. I'd kind of forgotten. I don't have Black Ribbon Day marked on my calendar, so I didn't realize until this morning that it was Black Ribbon Day. So I didn't realize I was going to be talking about this. But I appreciate you taking the time.
You know, a lot of people. I feel like Black Ribbon Day is funny because on one hand, it's been maybe the most effective historical revisionism project of this sort of interconnected group of fascist diaspora, and during the Cold War, there are various like intelligence agencies that were helping them sort of rewrite history. It's in a way it's very effective, but in another way, no one knows what the fuck it is. So
Yeah. Well,
or
for
cares.
those of us that are watching that are not familiar with Black Ribbon Day, do you just want to explain a little bit? We went over it a little bit before you got here. We've been talking about it, but do you just like in your own words, you just want to explain
Yeah,
what
yeah,
this is, Black Ribbon Day?
absolutely. So I think the best way to understand Black Ribbon Day is a work of like mid 80s historical revisionism by spearheaded by one man, Marcus Hess. He's an Estonian Canadian who's a member of one of these Baltic diaspora groups. Um, and the primary focus of Black Ribbon Day is to sort of offload responsibility for genocides during the Second World War from uh, fascists and their collaborators, and sort of equivocate Nazism with communism. It is primarily an anti-communist project, and in a way, it's kind of a form of Holocaust denial too. I would float that out there as
Yeah,
well.
at least Holocaust revisionism.
Yeah,
Like where,
Holocaust revisionism, 100%.
yeah, like it just on its surface, this idea that like, oh, the Nazis and the people who played the largest role in defeating the Nazis and liberating the concentration camps are all just as bad. And in many
Yes.
cases, they'll say that the Soviets were worse. A lot of these people that believe in this stuff. So that's the kind of revisionism that we're dealing with.
Well, that's the thing. Once you get past their sort of public-facing declarations, like the Liberal Party's declaration, once you get past that and sort of get into what they actually believe, there's very little mention of the Holocaust or Nazism or fascism at all. It's mostly focused on the crimes of the Russian state, the crimes of Stalin, uh, and it is very effective in diminishing or erasing the USSR's role in crushing fascism. Like there's an internal contradiction in the ideology of Black Ribbon Day, where history just kind of stops at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and you know everything that happened afterwards is kind of pushed aside.
Or before, like we've talked
Or
plenty about
before.
how the ruling
Yeah.
class of Canada and the United States were perfectly comfortable with the Nazis, their whole rise to power and everything that they were doing. They were perfectly aware of everything that was going on, and basically took the attitude of like, these guys are actually just great as long as they don't move west, as long as they stick, defeating the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
We're totally happy with these guys, and
Yeah.
this completely gets swept under the rug when we talk about this history, right?
That's right. And, I mean, just as a brief sidetrack, like Mackenzie King, the prime minister at the time, was completely enamored with Hitler.
He loved him, loved the guy, yeah.
He loved him. He loved him. They had their interests intersected on many levels. One of them being their love of like esotericism. Mackenzie King was an occultist. He might have been like an ice chewing Presbyterian, but he loved the occult. And he was really enamored by the Nazis' sort of adoption of like myth and a sense of like mystical destiny. So he was pretty reticent to get involved in the war.
Yeah. And so, like you pointed out, a lot of this, it comes, but there's a whole lot of things that are connected here. This idea of Black Ribbon Day, which is, of course, has been talked about a lot by Chrystia Freeland, who famously has this Ukrainian grandfather who was a Nazi collaborator.
That's right.
And she's spoken openly about how she like, not only is like, she's like proud of this heritage. She hasn't really even shied away from this.
Mhm.
And this is part of this whole project, which you were the first person to describe this to me. I really knew nothing about this. This is why I go to you when it comes to these conversations. This idea of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and how there is this deliberate project to bring in fascists from Ukraine to disrupt this sort of the more socialist leaning Ukrainian diaspora in Canada.
Yeah.
And that's why we have now these Nazi monuments that we often talk about, like for these Galician SS divisions, right?
Yes. And there's an interesting connection between Black Ribbon Day and besides the obvious connection, there's an interesting, like, very material connection between those monuments and Black Ribbon Day itself and the architects of Black Ribbon Day. I posted something about this earlier, but while I was doing research into the history of Black Ribbon Day, I found out that Marcus Hess, the sort of architect of the entire project, he was having trouble getting any kind of, let's say, non-diaspora support for this project until uh, and, until he met this guy David Somerville, who was the head of the National Citizens Coalition, which is like a right-wing at the time. This is the 80s in Canada, so this is a right-wing sort of Randian, small government, anti-tax, like ticks all the boxes. You guys know what it is.
Yeah.
So he meets Somerville, and they manage to repackage Hess's idea as something that's slightly more palatable, slightly less, pro-fascist. And with the help of the Anti-Bolshevik League of Nations and Radio Free Liberty and Radio Free Europe, and the contributions of an anti-communist mining oligarch here in Canada, they go to Europe, and they go on this whirlwind tour of Europe, and they speak at Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe. But the most important thing they do while they're there is they go to the Anti-Bolshevik League of Nations headquarters in Munich, and they meet with a woman named Slava Stetsko, who's a member of the OUN, that's the Stepan Bandera's nationalist organization, who collaborated with the Nazis. She's the wife of the leader of that wing of that organization. And there's an incredible picture of Hess and Somerville in, I believe, the spring of 1986 at the ABN offices with Slava Stetsko. They're talking about Black Ribbon Day, and behind them is a giant bust of Roman Shukevich, who is the guy who we have memorial statues to here. He's also the leader of something called the Nachtigall Battalion, which was responsible for liquidating over 100,000 Poles and Jews. So, a Nazi, a literal Nazi.
Yeah, and for anyone that's watching that's not familiar with this, I mean, this is why I like to talk to Dan about this, because he was explaining this to me in like 2018. But we've had sort of a national conversation over the last year or so, as we've had these incidents of vandalism at these monuments that are based in that are these monuments to these Galician SS divisions that carried out massacres on behalf of the Nazis. And it's interesting because this is all linked together, right? Black Ribbon Day, these Nazi memorials, and the Victims of Communism Foundation and the Victims of Communism Memorial that we're now building in Canada. And this idea that they try to equate the crimes of the Nazis and the Soviets. But often when you explore who these actual victims of communism were, you'll notice that they're actually including Nazis in this list, right?
Yeah, they are.
That's the really amazing thing.
Not just collaborators. Well, one very, very interesting thing that I don't think anyone's really reported on outside of maybe my podcast, The Bottleman with Riley, possibly Taylor Noakes brought it up in that CBC article, but one of the main architects of the Victims of Communism Memorial is fucking Marcus Hess. So yeah, and the very same organizations that pushed Black Ribbon Day. So in 1986, when they finally launched Black Ribbon Day, the association, the Black Ribbon Day Association, approached CBC. They had spent $60,000 on a series of television ads, and CBC rejected them because they thought that they were right-wing and nationalist and too anti-communist for CBC. And I'm just gonna pull up some report. I found this great piece of reporting this morning. I was going through newspapers.com just to see what the original reaction to the first Black Ribbon Day was.
Cool. If you want to link it to me, I can probably call it up on the screen.
I could just read it. I've got.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So this is from the Globe and Mail. It says a group financed in part by the right-wing National Citizens Coalition plans to stage a day of protest against the Soviet Union, which organizers say is intent on ruling the world. Marcus Hess, chairman of the International Black Ribbon Day Committee, said his group believes that the Soviet Union wishes to orchestrate a slow and insidious takeover of the entire world. The committee, which released 2 television commercials Wednesday, is organizing protest rallies and observances on August 23rd in Canada, Australia, Sweden, the United States, France, and England. So that's the media reaction to the first Black Ribbon Day.
Yeah, amazing.
And now today, it's like Trudeau is, dropping like a 4-paragraph statement about how important this day is.
Well, that's the interesting thing you pointed out. If this was too much for CBC originally, you see how there's been this shift, and like you see this propaganda campaign kind of slowly working, basically, and becoming just kind of common, accepted historical understanding, which is completely inaccurate. There's been this this very deliberate process that's paying dividends now for these exact folks.
Yeah, it's doing the thing that it's supposed to do, which is kind of melt these 2 oppositional forces, fascism and communism, into one big slurry.
Yeah, and that's really the irony for me about all of this stuff. It is that it's ultimately it's about horseshoe theory, right? Horseshoe theory is like it's like what I often say is that it's like the bedrock that all of our Western propaganda is built off of. It's kind of the basic idea that it's all built off of. When like the real actual horseshoe theory, which is this is kind of like disguising, is the union between these anti-communist liberals and actual fascists who seem like they have much more in common than communists and fascists do. That's the real thing that's being disguised here.
That is it. That's the liberals' agenda, on a material level is in a lot of ways indistinguishable. If you get rid of the sort of memory politics, yearning for the homeland aspect of the diaspora ideology, the liberal and fascist project is exactly the same. It's an anti-communist project. Like, the liberal government, the Canadian government imported Hungarian fascists to break the Inco strike in the early 1950s in Sudbury. Like, there were literally, I was reading testimony from union bosses at the Inco smelter, and they were talking about seeing guys with SS tattoos in the showers, after a shift.
Jesus. Yeah. And so when you kind of understand this as this sort of like bedrock historical understanding of our ruling class, a lot of stuff starts to make sense as well, right? That maybe might not have previously. And you can see a lot of that happening now with the way that tensions are ramping up against China, and it's a lot of the same sort of rhetoric and the same sort of criticisms that a lot of these ruling class types have, and they're using this. They've built this foundation, this kind of like this foundation of historical revisionism. They've built a lot of propaganda on top of that, and now they're wielding that. As you see China rising to become this like global hegemon, a competing interest with the United States in terms of like the global economy, and you can see now this is like paying dividends for them as they feel their grip slipping on power. They're now employing this kind of propaganda and using that against the rise of China, modern China.
That's very true, and I've been thinking about this a lot the last couple of weeks, especially covering victims of communism and with this Black Ribbon Day today, is that for a while these groups, like these anti-fascist, quote unquote anti-fascist groups, fascist groups rather, anti-communist groups, they disappeared from like the public sphere for a while after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were not as necessary as they were during the 80s, especially not as necessary as they were during the 1950s and 60s. But something happened, like you can, with the rise of China and with a Russian state that is not completely under the boot of American economic planning, these groups have become useful again. And the weird thing is they haven't changed their playbook at all. So you get this bizarre kind of timeline disconnect when you hear these people talk. China, for them, the China of 2021 and the Russia of 2021 are indistinguishable from those countries in the 1960s or 70s.
Yeah, and we talk often about in this community too about how like our the sort of the people that are in charge of the sort of national security establishment are kind of like de facto pushing these governments into coalition with one another, and they're kind of forcing China and Russia and other sort of victims of imperialism like Iran, Venezuela, and all these different countries. They're kind of forcing them to collaborate and to communicate with each other, and then that again is like used as further examples for why these things are necessary and why the military buildup is necessary and why they need to continue countering them with sanctions and military actions and all this stuff. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, this feedback loop, where they've kind of created a new boogeyman, which they can now use to justify all the kind of weird designs they have in terms of global power, right?
Yeah, it's actually kind of incredible that China and Russia didn't have a stronger military cooperation, economic cooperation, considering they share this huge land border. And I forget what America, it might have been CNN, did a very long interview with Putin recently. That's just super painful to watch. The whole thing is like an attempt at a gotcha, and he's.
Was that the one where he was talking about the U.S. because he was like, I lived through the end of the Soviet Union and I see a lot of the same things in terms of the sort of the collapsing empire? That was painful.
Yeah, there's an interesting part in that where the interviewer is pressing him on this collaboration between Russia and China, and he's basically like, you pushed us into it, and we do share like one of the world's largest land borders. So like, what do you want from us? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Another thing we've been talking about a lot, I mean, it's sort of a tangentially related, but we've been talking a lot today about the way that the liberal media class is completely losing their minds about this Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah.
And how they're completely giving up any pretense of being objective or not, doing non-activist journalism, or they've just completely given up on this idea that they're objective in any way. And they're completely just like losing their minds about this. Haven't you been talking on Bottleman recently too about something about Afghanistan and Canada's role in that?
Yeah, we had our producer Nate on, who actually served in Afghanistan for at least a couple of years, and he had a lot to say about Canada's role as like Canada kind of putting forward an ideology of how do I explain this? I guess it's like doing pro-human rights stuff without defining what that stuff is, and then the disastrous fallout from that. And one of the examples he gave was, like he was in charge of overseeing the repainting of a hospital that was he determined that it was going to cost something like $300,000. It ended up costing over $1 million. There was a lot of graft involved. People were mixing gasoline into the paint that they were using in the hospital, which made a lot of people sick. And he just kind of used that as an example of back home in Canada, this is something like that is being presented as we're doing human rights. We're rebuilding infrastructure.
Yeah.
Really what it was just creating a situation where graft could flow very easily.
Well, and I think that's what ties everything together. This whole idea of horseshoe theory and Canada's role as like, we're against these authoritarian regimes and we're pro human rights. That's always been sort of the excuse that we have used to justify all kinds of brutal colonialism and all kinds of terrible, terrible things that we've been privy to. And I think convincing people of that has been very, very successful, and convincing people that these extremists of fascism and communism are that's an authoritarianism. These are all stuff that we're against. And in our wonderful enlightened liberal democracy where we care about human rights and things, we only do these things for these benefits and to benefit human beings and to spread democracy and to do all these things. But this has always just been complete bullshit. I mean, it's always just been complete propaganda bullshit designed to often for us to go into these other countries with our mining interests and different resource extraction projects, and to brutally abuse human rights in all these cases. But this idea,
or like infrastructure spending with SNC-Lavalin contracts
yes,
in Libya,
exactly.
you know, like it's just human rights is just such a vague. It's perfect. It is perfect for like this kind of managerial class, technocratic, liberal sort of imperialism, in that it's such a vaguely defined concept. You can slot anything into it, you know, but it delivers an emotional response. I think people have been conditioned to have a specific response to the words human rights without
Sure.
interrogating what those rights actually mean. Like, what rights and for who?
Yeah, well, and that's the
Why?
thing. And most people do, like, it works because people do care about it. They don't want to be part of a country that steps on human rights. They want to be part of a project that supports these things. That's been the really, like, alarming thing, I think, about the last 2 weeks with this Afghanistan withdrawal, tying it back to that.
Yeah.
The sudden hand-wringing about human rights in Afghanistan and what's going to happen to human rights, what's going to happen with women's rights in Afghanistan, while completely ignoring everything that's happened over the last 20 years and the way that it's been a human rights fucking calamity in this region. And it's very strange, I think, to see people that respond to this relentless media push about this with this kind of concern for human rights that all of a sudden we're talking about, when the media has been completely ignoring this entire situation for years. They've talked about this for a grand total of, a couple of minutes over the last 5 years. But now all of a sudden it's the number one concern.
And often the people talking about this are the people who were the biggest cheerleaders for the fucking war in the first place, who
Yes.
like manufactured consent for this thing, you know, like David Frum, great example. He had a just brain melting piece on Afghanistan about a week ago. You know, it's people like him who are now talking about like human rights in Afghanistan, who in a lot of ways got us and the Americans there in the first place.
Yeah. And
a
lot of these types are really supportive of this exact sort of victims of communism horseshoe theory mentality. They're the first people to propagate this kind of idea.
Yeah. The other thing I'm kind of interested in, which is sort of like an esoteric side effect of all this, is the more like McDonald Laurier Institute, that like right-wing think tank world. Some of their reporting on Afghanistan feels like they are sending a trial balloon to see if they can convince the Canadian government to sanction Pakistan, which is really interesting.
Okay.
like all of the shit coming out of the McDonald Laurier Institute right now is like, Pakistan is responsible for the Taliban. Pakistan is collaborating with our biggest enemy, China. We must sanction Pakistan.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because Prime Minister Khan in Pakistan has been openly like supportive of China, has been openly talking about for having more of an economic partnership with them. So you can see that there's like a direct relationship between these two things.
Yeah, and I'm not saying Pakistan isn't totally, and ISI aren't totally involved with the protracted war in Afghanistan, and part of that, like, shifting sands of occupation. But now that the Americans are gone, it's kind of like, what else are you going to do? You need stability in the country, right? Of course Pakistan is going to talk to China, because China is going to offer, best case scenario, they're going to offer infrastructural stability, economic stability, best case scenario. Like, but I think the problem is, I think people like MLI and the people who work at MLI and people like David Frum can't look at this this American withdrawal outside of any context but the context of like good and evil.
Yeah.
Which is completely outdated thinking. Like,
yeah, absolutely. Well, and then, that's often the question that comes up as well. Like when you talk about like the CIA or any of the sort of like really brutal imperialist actions of the last the post-war period. Are these guys true believers? Or are they just doing what have to be done to increase profits for the national defense industry? And often you find that they are true believers. Like they do really believe this. They've cultivated this kind of cult-like mentality for all these guys who
Yeah.
do kind of on some level believe that they are doing the right thing, that they are defending human rights. And it just so happens that all these decisions, even when, you know, millions of civilians are getting put into this fucking meat grinder, and in part of this process, and it has this like profound economic effect on these evil weapons manufacturers, that's kind of a convenient side benefit for them. But they really do believe this shit. They're not just evil sociopaths that are just lying about it, or at least I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting to see what side of the line some people fall on. Like you know, with the victims of communism stuff, I can usually tell if I'm reading, you know, an article written by someone who works at one of these diaspora organizations or someone who works for MLI, whether they're or whatever another type of think tank that's pushing this ideology. I can usually tell whether they're dead-eyed sociopaths
Yeah.
or or true believers, or like crusaders. You know, I feel like somebody like Marcus Kolga, for instance, who works for McDonald Laurier, is a true believer. He
Yeah.
is. He's a grifter, but he's also, he believes every word he says.
Yeah. Isn't he a former band guy too? Kolga? I think we talked about this last time.
A former what now?
Like a former like music industry guy.
Yeah, he produced a documentary on psychedelic and like punk music in the Baltics.
Okay.
He's kind of like a failed filmmaker.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. And he is kind of responsible for bringing Bill like Browder into the Canadian political orbit, like
Okay.
introducing like the idea of Magnitsky acting people.
Okay, I see.
He's
Marcus Kolga just sounds evil. He sounds like a villain in like a Steven Seagal movie or something.
Yeah, he kind of looks like that too. But he also is, I feel like, is instrumental in the Latvian Ministry of Defense's influence on Canadian foreign policy via his McDonald Laurier Institute.
Yeah.
You know, like he made inroads and bridges there. So
yeah. Well, Dan, always really interesting to talk to you about this stuff. Again, you're my go-to source on this kind of stuff. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come and break down some of this stuff for us, for the community. We all really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Love to talk about Black Ribbon Day.
Yeah, hell yeah! It's a solemn memorial here from us today.
It is.
I just wanted to plug your, you mentioned the Bottlemen. You just want to let everyone know where they can find the Bottlemen, or anything else you want people to know about before we sign off here.
Yeah, if you're interested in this type of sort of erased history of Canada, I have a podcast with Riley from Trash Future called The Bottlemen. We're on Patreon. It's 2 episodes a week. Occasionally we cover corner gas as well. We've been making our way through the entire series and subjecting our American friends to it. We had the Pot About List guys on a little while ago. It was punishing, just punishing, but super fun. So I've got that, and then if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I make, I have a Patreon called Biblioteca with my partner Dev, and it's a couple of songs every month. And we stream movies on Saturdays. So it's all like new content, new songs that aren't on any albums or anything, just on the Patreon.
Oh, great.
So that's it.
Are you possibly, what's the, like, because I know it looked kind of like things were returning to some sense of normalcy. Are there any possible like touring plans coming up, or like has that been scuttled by the Delta variant and all the rise in cases and shit like that?
It's so bad, man. Yeah, it's not great. I mean, your options are either go with like kind of a cowboy style promotion company that doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And and that's probably going to be in one of a few American states, or just keep waiting.
Okay.
So yeah, it's definitely not back to normal yet, but people are booking. I mean, Wolf Parade has shows booked for 2022 for the spring.
Okay.
And I think that's a safe bet. Like I need to believe that's a safe bet.
That would be nice. Yeah.
Especially considering touring is like 90% of my income, and it's been gone for the last 18 months.
Yes.
Yeah.
For all of our sakes, I hope you're able to get back on that. It'd be great to see you if you end up doing some shows here. Thanks again, Dan Boeckner. Great to talk to you, and I'll be in touch, man. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Rob. See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye. Dan Boeckner, everybody.